I want to thank Pastor David Pranga for doing our devotions last week while I was in Omaha, Nebraska for American Baptist Churches in the USA board meetings, and then our biennial mission summit, our every other year denomination-wide celebration that Jill and I were able to attend, as well as Joe and Shelby Greenmore. Today, we're going to start in Romans. Romans is the longest letter or epistle that we have in the New Testament, 16 chapters long, and it is Paul's major theological work. And the theme of Romans is how the gospel is God's power for salvation for all. And Paul builds this argument chapter by chapter. The first 11 chapters of Romans are really Paul's theology, his theological argument. And then chapters 12 to the end are, so what difference does this make? What are the implications of this theology for how we live our lives? We are following along with Nikki and Pippa Gumble with their reading. So yesterday we started in Romans. So if you haven't been following along, you can read all of Romans chapter 1. You will be with me as we go through this very important work of Paul. So the theme of Romans is found in chapter 1, verse 16. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. And then, starting in verse 18 through the end of chapter 1, Paul begins building his argument, and he starts with God's judgment upon sin, regardless of what that sin is or who is sinning, whether that person is a Jew or a Greek. And in verse 18 it says, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and wickedness of those who by their wickedness suppress the truth. The rest of chapter 1, Paul goes on to describe how from the very beginning, even since the creation of the world, God's eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things he has made. So in other words, the created order, all of nature, the planet Earth, everything that lives in it, the stars and planets in the heavens, all these things reveal God's beauty, God's creative power, before we even had a word of God or Jesus, the scriptures that we have. And the important point I want to leave you with today from Romans 1 and God's judgment upon sin is that we are all guilty. And we're going to hear that by the time we get to chapter 3, verse 23. But we shouldn't single out as if one sin is somehow worse than another sin. And in the rest of chapter 1, Paul will describe a whole bunch of sins. God's judgment is on sin, and we are all guilty. And the question is, what can we do about it? And there's nothing to do about it. But thankfully, there was something that God could do about it through Jesus. And that's what we'll hear as we continue through Romans.